It's Friday the 30th of June, and this is Politics UK. Hello and welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week,
in light of the visible lack of discipline on the Russian side, the Ukrainians will prevail.
After last weekend's revolt by the Wagner Group against Vladimir Putin, the Foreign Secretary tells MPs cracks are emerging in Russian support for the war in Ukraine. At Prime Minister's questions, Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer clash over house building.
1 minute he says he's for building new houses, the next he's campaigning against them.
I would say to them, though, they don't have to worry too much because he's never actually kept a promise he's made.
I have never seen anything more clueless and chaotic than this.
Labour's do-nothing approach to stopping the vote is the fastest route to more crossings, greater taxpayer spending and more pressure on our communities.
What is the real cost of removing asylum seekers to Rwanda? And in the Senate, heated debate over NHS waiting times in Wales.
You talk about the decrease in two-year waits. 261 people came off that two-year wait. There's still over 30,000 people waiting 2 years or more here in Wales.
The median time, the standard time it takes to be treated in the Welsh NHS from the minute your doctor refers you to the minute your treatment is concluded is 20 weeks.
Sean, hello. Many thanks for being with us this week. Let's begin with those extraordinary events we saw last weekend in Russia when the head of the Wagner mercenary group ordered his men to march on Moscow before calling off that rebellion. Just remind us very briefly what happened and tell us what the reaction was in Parliament.
So, MPs left Westminster on Thursday evening. By the time they arrived on Monday, all sorts of things had happened. As you say, the leader of the Wagner military group, we know he'd had some concerns with the way that Russia was prosecuting the war in Ukraine. He went public with that. He then ordered this march on Moscow, or at least that's how it appeared. We weren't clear whether this was a mutiny or a rebellion or even a coup. Then all of a sudden, almost as soon as all this had happened, we were told he'd ordered his troops back. And the next thing we heard was that he was going into exile. So there were lots of questions for MPs. Ministers over the weekend had been contacting the UK's international allies, and there had been meetings with ministers, and the emergency room, COBRA, it always sounds very dramatic. It's always a little bit less dramatic than it sounds. They'd been having these meetings. They were trying to work out what was going on. And so at the very start of the parliamentary week, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, came to MPs to update them.
Prigozhin's rebellion is an unprecedented challenge to President Putin's authority, and it is clear that cracks are emerging in the Russian support for the war. I, of course, hold no candle for Prigozhin or his forces. They have committed atrocities in Ukraine and elsewhere, but he has said out loud what we have believed since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, that this invasion was both unjustified and unprovoked.
The events that unfolded shone a light on serious problems in Russia. Prigozhin has been a long time and close ally of Putin. It's staggering that Prigozhin publicly challenged not only Putin's leadership, but the false narrative Putin used to justify his full-scale invasion, challenging the lie that Ukraine or NATO posed a threat to Russia, and stating clearly what we all know, that Putin's full-scale invasion is failing on its own terms.
It's clear that Putin has been significantly weakened in Russia. And we must not use this time to let up in our support for Ukraine. So first of all, we need to make sure the Ukrainian membership of NATO is fast-tracked at the Vilnius NATO summit. Secondly, we need to make sure there is no talk of deals or concessions or lifting of sanctions on Russia in any circumstances until the war criminals are held to account.
It has been reported that UK diplomats are preparing for the collapse of Putin's government. How likely does the Secretary of State see this in the short to medium term? And will they be better prepared for this collapsing regime than they were in Afghanistan?
We've always made the point, I will repeat it for sake of clarity, the leadership of Russia is for the Russian people. We do not speculate or attempt to predict. What we do is plan and put in place contingency arrangements. And so, therefore, whatever the outcome of this conflict is, we shall be prepared. But I have no doubt that with our international support and in light of the visible lack of discipline on the Russian side, the Ukrainians will prevail, and we will continue working side by side with our international partners in supporting them until they do.
Lots of questions raised there by what happened in Russia last weekend. But Sean, here, the dominant issue once again this week has been the cost of living, specifically rising food prices and mortgage interest rates. This week began with the Chancellor setting out measures to help homeowners facing rising mortgage payments. What did he say?
Yes, at the end of last week, Jeremy Hunt held what he called a mortgage summit in Downing Street, where he talked to the biggest lenders. And he came to the Commons then this week to launch what he called the Mortgage Charter. Essentially, it's a voluntary agreement with the biggest lenders that it will allow people to perhaps change the way they're paying off their mortgage, and it'll also include a 12-month cooling off period on repossessions. All measures, he said, would actually help people who are borrowing to buy a home. But he also came under some pressure over what the banks were doing about interest rates and whether they would pass on the rises to savers. So he faced quite a lot of broad concerns about the cost of living when he came to launch his new charter.
These measures should offer comfort to those who are anxious about the impact of higher interest rates on their mortgages and provide support to those who do get into any extreme financial difficulties. Tackling inflation is the Prime Minister and my #1 priority. We said we would halve inflation, not because it was an easy thing to do, but because it is the right thing to do. And we won't flinch in our resolve, because we know getting rid of high inflation from our economy is the only way that we can ultimately relieve pressure on family finances and on businesses.
Families are worried, sick to their stomach, about what is happening at the moment. But the Prime Minister says, don't worry, it will all be OK. But it's not going to be OK for the millions of homeowners who face an average increase of mortgage costs this year of £2,900. For many, the Tory mortgage bombshell will mean holidays cancelled, families' savings draining away and missing out on days spent with family and friends. But for others, it could be much worse. Not moving up the housing ladder, but heading down it through no fault of their own. Our measures were a requirement. Yes, a requirement. Because all lenders need to play their part when people are struggling. Our plan would have provided real help, but government have provided just a bad cover version.
Did he notice, like I did, that the banks this quarter made over £4 billion extra on the differential between these? So shouldn't he have been much tougher on the banks? And what is he going to do to stop this profiteering?
Well, the Right Honourable Lady is absolutely right. It is taking too long for the increases in interest rates to be passed on to savers. She's right, there is an issue there. I raised that issue in no uncertain terms with the banks when I met them, and I'm working on a solution because I think it is an issue that needs resolving.
Now that the majority of the mortgage market is predominantly fixed, not floating, would he agree that rising short-term interest rates will not necessarily result in falling inflation, and that we do need to look at other measures, and such as making sure that interest rates are passed on to savers so that they keep their money in the bank?
She's absolutely right. I mean, it is still the case that, notwithstanding the fact that 85% of mortgages now are fixed to some degree, there will be an extra 1.2 million people who will feel these, 1.2 million families who will feel the increase in interest rates over the months between now and the end of this year. So It will be felt by many, many families, but we should do everything within our power to tackle inflation, because in the end, that is the only way to end the misery for so many people.
We're going to keep asking him again and again until he answers. Why is it that people are paying £800 less in Germany than here, £1,000 less in Ireland and Belgium than here, and £2,000 less in France than here? What is it that their governments, their economies are doing differently? Or is it just that they don't have the problem of 13 years of this Tory government that's behind it?
Core inflation is higher in more than half EU countries, so it isn't just about us.
A lot of concern there about the impact of rising interest rates on mortgage holders. But Sean, we also heard this week, didn't we, from the managers from the big four supermarkets who were up before the Business Select Committee. What were they being questioned about?
Well, they essentially rejected allegations that they were profiteering at the expense of their customers because of inflation. They insisted that they weren't passing many of their costs on. They also rejected the idea that there should be some sort of price cap on basic food items.
And the middle of the week, we had Prime Minister's questions, a clash between Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak over house building.
Yes, it's another aspect of the cost of living situation. The Conservatives at the last election promised to build 300,000 houses a year in England. And they said they would do that through local authority targets. But that was all watered down or diluted, and it became an advisory thing rather than a compulsory thing. Keir Starmer, in a week when Labour's very keen to present itself as the party of the homeowner and talking about house building, decided to major on that when he faced Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, his party spent thousands of pounds on adverts attacking plans to build 300,000 new homes a year. At the same time, his housing minister says it's Tory party policy to build 300,000 new homes a year. So is he for building 300,000 new homes a year or against it?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I can just remind the honourable gentleman of our record since being in office. 2.2 million additional homes, Mr. Speaker. Housing starts double the number we inherited from the Labour Party. More homes meeting the decent home standards. Housing supply up 10% in the last year that we have figures for. And in the last year we had figures for, we also saw a 20-year high in the number of first-time buyers, Mr. Speaker. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a difficult question. Can he point to a single person in housing, in construction, anywhere, who thinks he'll actually hit his target of 300,000 new homes a year? Anyone?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the record is that in the last 3 years, we've delivered almost record numbers of new home building in every one of those years. But Mr. Speaker, he talks about targets, so let's be clear. I promised to put local people in control of new housing. I delivered on that policy within weeks of becoming Prime Minister. But I am confused from the honourable gentleman, because first, the Shadow Community and Housing Secretary said communities should have control. But then he said we should get the targets back and disempower local people. I do want to give him some advice. I don't think it's local people that are the problem. It's a Labour Party policy.
Mr. Speaker, presumably if he could have identified a single person who thought he'd hit his target, he would have told us. And there you have the problem. 1 minute he says he's for building new houses, the next he's campaigning against them. And the truth is, far from delivering, since he crumbled to his backbenchers and scrapped mandatory targets, house building has collapsed. He knows it, they know it, and every expert is telling them it. Why didn't he just admit it? He's not going to get anywhere near his target, is he?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman now claims that he supports house building, especially on the green belt. But unfortunately for him, it's good that he agrees that he does believe that now. But unfortunately for him, the Shadow Deputy Prime Minister, the Shadow Minister for Women, the Shadow Health, Justice, Defence, Business, Northern Ireland and Scotland ministers are all united against more house building in their areas, Mr. Speaker. I have to say to them, though, Mr. Speaker, I would say to them, though, they don't have to worry too much because he's never actually kept a promise he's made.
Mr. Speaker, it's sort of housing crisis, what crisis with this Prime Minister? He must be the only person in the country who thinks that enough houses have been built in the last 13 years. And whether it's those dreaming of getting the keys to their first home or those already with mortgages, the ambitions of families across the country have been crushed by his failing Tory government. House building at his lowest rate since the war because he can't stand up to his own party. A Tory mortgage bombshell because they crashed the economy. Millions left without support because he won't make lenders put families first. Rather than lecturing the rest of the country on holding their nerve, why doesn't he try and locate his?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as always, he hasn't actually taken the time to understand the detail of what we're doing. So, again, I'm happy to explain it again, Mr. Speaker, because it's right that we provide support for mortgage owners, which is why we improve the generosity of the support for mortgage interest scheme. It's why we've introduced a new mortgage charter, which, by the way, goes much more farther than the Labour Party policy on protecting mortgage holders does. On house building, we're proud to protect the green belt and invest millions more in developing brownfield sites. But, Mr. Speaker, the simple truth is, that's what I said I would do, and that's what we've delivered, and that is the difference between us. I deliver what I promise, he just breaks his.
Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, the Prime Minister patronised the public when he told them that in the face of ever-increasing mortgage bills, that they simply need to hold their nerve. What a nerve. So may I ask him, the near billionaire, when was the last time that he struggled to pay a bill?
Mr. Speaker, the reason that mortgage rates are rising is because of inflation, Mr. Speaker. That is the root cause, which is why it's absolutely the right policy to tackle, halve inflation and reduce it back to target. Now, that does mean that we do have to make difficult decisions. It does mean we have to be patient while the impact of those decisions actually has an impact. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, as I was explaining previously, we are taking practical steps to support mortgage holders across the United Kingdom, particularly through the SMI scheme and the new mortgage charter.
This week's Prime Minister's questions. Sean, many thanks for now. We will be back with you a little bit later. But to Edinburgh now, and our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jenny, in the last week, the SNP has been discussing its options for another vote on independence. Where did they get to?
Well, that's right. Last weekend, the SNP held an independence convention in Dundee to discuss different options for another independence vote, given that ruling by the Supreme Court last year that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the power to hold an independence referendum. But alongside that, the party's been, and the Scottish Government has been promoting the idea of having a written constitution in an independent Scotland that sets out some basic rights. The Scottish Government published a paper on that last week, and then this week it held a debate at Holyrood.
We are doing what we have been asked to do by the electorate, and we have published what I think is a hugely exciting document, and regardless of whether one wishes Scotland to be independent or not, imagine the future of this country where its rights, its obligations, its form is represented through a written constitution, just like pretty much every single other country in the world.
Now, I'll come to the actual paper, which is the subject matter of this debate, in a moment, Deputy Presiding Officer. But I have to say, it pales in comparison with what we witnessed over the weekend in Dundee, which very much sets the context for this debate. We saw a First Minister, or First Activist, as he calls himself, announce that he wants to turn the next general election into another polarising and divisive vote on breaking up the United Kingdom. The SNP have effectively come up with a turbocharged version of Nicola Sturgeon's de facto referendum, except this time it seems the SNP has set the bar even lower by saying they don't need to win a majority of votes or even a majority of seats. They say they just need to win more seats than any other party. It's a nonsense, Deputy Presiding Officer.
We're having this debate today because of the SNP convention in Dundee at the weekend and the need for the SNP leadership to kid on to the grassroots that they are making progress when they aren't. We're therefore having to indulge in an exercise in SNP internal party management, as well as a desperate attempt for the SNP to try and be relevant at the next general election.
And as you heard there at that independence convention, Humza Yousaf set out his proposals for using a general election as a vote on independence. He said his preferred option would still be for the UK government to agree to another referendum. But he said if the SNP got a majority of seats and they couldn't get that agreement, they might just use the general election itself as a vote and begin negotiations on independence after the election. But of course there is that question of whether other parties would recognise that vote, and in particular if the SNP were to get fewer seats than it has at the moment.
The Scottish Government updated Parliament on plans to incorporate the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child into Scottish law. That has proved controversial, hasn't it? Just remind us of the background to this.
Yes, so the actual content of the legislation, the bill, wasn't controversial at the time. It was passed unanimously in March 2021 by MSPs across all parties. But then it was one of two bills that was challenged by the UK government as being out with the powers of the Scottish Parliament, and the UK Supreme Court backed that view. So it's the first bill that's been sent back to the Scottish Parliament for reconsideration. Now, Social Justice Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville said that in order to avoid future problems like that, the bill would now be limited to just covering acts of the Scottish Parliament, so relevant UK legislation would be excluded from it. Labour not happy about those exclusions, but the Scottish Conservatives more unhappy about the time it's taken to bring back that revised bill.
Presiding Officer, once again we find the democratic will of this Parliament being blocked by Westminster. With devolution under attack, we cannot simply afford to leave rights such as UNCRC at the behest of a Tory government. Surely the fact that we are seeing the UNCRC threatened by the repugnant illegal migration bill is proof enough that this bill is essential for protecting children in Scotland.
I am becoming increasingly annoyed by this government and its inability to legislate. It has been 834 days since the UNCRC bill was passed in this Parliament, 630 days since the Supreme Court ruled in favour of the UK government's challenge of the bill. That's 630 days for this government to decide whether or not to write a letter to the UK government about the UNCRC bill. No wonder nothing gets done in this place. Instead of making the necessary changes to this bill, the SNP have deliberately provoked grievance, have continued to politicise children's rights, have played constitutional games and have prioritised a debate on independence this afternoon.
So Shirley-Anne Somerville has committed to bringing back a clear, coherent and workable bill that will be within the competence of the Parliament and will deliver some protection of children's rights, bit of an emphasis on some, less comprehensive than she wanted. But that's going to come back to Holyrood in the autumn after the summer recess.
And Jenny, we've been hearing evidence from the UK COVID inquiry this week, but the Scottish COVID inquiry also came up at FMQs with questions about a delay and how the Scottish Government will cooperate with it.
That's right. So there's been evidence from former Scottish Government ministers at the UK COVID inquiry this week. We've heard from former Health Secretary Jean Freeman, former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and former Deputy First Minister John Swinney on pandemic preparedness. But the Scottish COVID inquiry is yet to take evidence. It's been beset by some problems. Its original chair resigned in October, as did 4 members of the legal team. It's got a new chair, Lord Brailsford, but that has put things back. Now, at First Minister's questions, Labour leader Anna Sarwar expressed concern and frustration at that delay, but he also asked about an instruction from the Scottish inquiry to the Scottish Government that documents be retained, a do not destroy order, and asked whether all relevant documents and messages would be handed over in full.
COVID took a heavy toll on everyone across this country, and we continue to feel its impact. The least we can expect is that when grieving families come looking for answers, this SNP government provides them. Because we know, sadly, that this is a government famed for a culture of secrecy and cover-up. Last week, Dr Lisa Mitchell, KC, the lawyer for the bereaved families across Scotland, said this at the UK COVID inquiry: "No person, no institution, no matter how powerful, whether it be in England, Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, Westminster, Holyrood, can obstruct the search for truth." So will the First Minister commit to writing to me and other members of this Parliament outlining what steps the Scottish Government has taken to ensure that all ministers and officials, past and present, have complied with the Do Not Destroy order, and how this data is being retained and how it will be handed over to the inquiry?
I think it's really important for me to absolutely reiterate that we have, of course, and have had a long-standing policy on retention of documents, and not just documents, in fact, as per email or written correspondence, but including social media messages. So I'm more than happy for that guidance to be shared. I'm more than happy to write to Anna Sawa or any other member who has an interest around how we comply with those various guidelines that are very much in place. What I would also say to Anna Sawa is this is absolutely about the bereaved families. That's why the government has met with the families who have been bereaved by COVID. We will cooperate fully with that inquiry. Anna Sawa suggests that we are not transparent. I would remind him it is this government who instructed that public inquiry.
And the Scottish Parliament has now gone into its summer recess, so here at Holyrood we'll be back with you in September.
Jenny Davidson at Holyrood, many thanks indeed for bringing us up to date. Now, Sean, let's return to Westminster. And the Prime Minister has made clear one of his key priorities is to stop people crossing the Channel in small boats. A key part of the government's strategy is this scheme to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda. And this week we were given details, weren't we, about an economic impact assessment of the illegal migration bill. Sounds rather technical, doesn't it? But just talk us through what we learned from that document.
Yeah, so when a bill is going through Parliament, the idea is that officials prepare a report for ministers. They're talking about the costs of the proposals. The illegal migration bill has already been through the Commons and it's now in the Lords. So there's been some questions about when this report was going to be published. When it did come out, it revealed that it could cost thousands of pounds more to send an asylum seeker to Rwanda than it would be to house them here. And what we then had were exchanges in the Commons where an immigration minister, the Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, not the Home Secretary, faced questions from Labour.
The asylum system currently costs £3.6 billion a year and £6 million a day in hotel accommodation. Now, that is not the true cost of doing nothing. As this impact assessment shows, the cost of accommodating illegal migrants has increased dramatically since 2020. And if these trends continue, the Home Office would be spending over £11 billion a year, or £32 million a day, on asylum support by the end of 2026. In such a scenario, the bill would only need to deliver a 2% deterrence in arrivals to enable cost savings.
This is not an impact assessment. According to the government's own guidance, it's supposed to include the costs, benefits and risks and a consideration of a range of options. Instead, it says this impact assessment does not attempt to estimate any costs of implementing the bill or estimate the volumes of individuals that will be impacted by the bill. Really, what is the point of it? It admits, the document admits themselves, that people may not be deterred by any of this, and it cannot answer the most basic questions. I have never seen anything more clueless and chaotic than this. They've crashed the economy, now they've crashed the asylum system too. You've got an impact assessment, shows the Home Office haven't got a clue, the Treasury haven't got a grip, and the Prime Minister, who claims to be Mr. Fix It, is instead Mr. Muck It Up. The country deserves better than this.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady misses the point. If people continue to cross in small boats, the cost to the taxpayer, in one form or another, will continue to increase. And this is a completely unacceptable outcome. Labour's do-nothing approach to stopping the boat is the fastest route to more crossings, greater taxpayer spending and more pressure on our communities. Left unchecked, the cost will spiral to £11 billion by 2026. That is the cost of a Labour Home Secretary. That is the cost of Cooper.
Will you accept from me that if you're fleeing chaos in Syria or Iraq, you're not going to be deterred to come because you're going to be put up in a cosy, warm former airman's bedroom in RAF Scampton, rather than a hotel embracing cold Skegness. So isn't the solution to this to get this bill through, the House of Lords stop their silly games and pass it into law?
Where's the impact assessment on the victims of modern slavery of these proposals? And has he made any assessment at all of the likelihood that people will still come to this country, to our shores, by small boats, but simply not claim asylum, slipping underneath the radar, ending up in slavery and criminality? Where is the comprehensive assessment of this ridiculous policy?
The costs to the UK taxpayer of the current levels of asylum seekers are extremely high. And then, as the report says, there are non-monetised costs, like the housing shortage, like public services, like the challenge to community cohesion and integration. It's for all of those reasons and others that we have to get a grip on this challenge.
Sean, the government determined to press ahead with its Rwanda plan, but it reached the Court of Appeal on Thursday this week. Why was the court ruling on it?
Yeah, so there are two arguments going along in parallel here. There's the parliamentary political argument about the illegal migration bill. There's also been this legal challenge to the plans. Thursday, the Court of Appeal ruled 2-1 that the government's plans were unlawful, and they said that was because Rwanda was deemed not to be a safe country. Now, the government has said that they don't agree with that decision and they are going to look to appeal it. So it will go to the Supreme Court. So the legal argument isn't over, but actually the parliamentary argument isn't over either, because also this week the House of Lords inflicted a string of defeats on the government, introducing changes to the bill which ministers say would wreck their plans. So not only do they have a battle on their hands in the House of Lords, but at some point we're going to see a big row over this policy between the Commons and the Lords.
So still a long way to go on that. Now, there was also some concerning news about Thames Water this week, wasn't there? That serves a quarter of the UK population. Its boss resigned unexpectedly on Tuesday. What exactly happened?
Well, there are concerns that Thames Water is in big trouble, and there are all sorts of questions for ministers about, well, what would the government do? Could it step in? And so a minister came to the Commons and there were some exchanges from MPs wanting to know what the government's position was, but of course they also wanted to know what was going to happen to customers.
It was clear to anyone looking on that a culture that allowed vital investment in ending the sewage scandal and in tackling water leaks, sacrificed in favour of a gold rush for shareholders, just was never sustainable. Now, the news that we're seeing is a result of the Conservative Party's failed profit above public interest experiment, handing over the water industry at a knockdown price, together with the entire infrastructure serving the nation, over to private enterprise.
Since privatisation, capital investment in the water industry has been 84% higher than it was pre-privatisation. So I think we need to get that out there on the table. And in terms of the water company mentioned today, Thames Water, it's not for me to comment on the individual financial position of a water company. We have an independent regulator who is doing that. That is what the regulator Ofwat is indeed for. Water companies are commercial entities, and it is for the company and its investors to resolve any possible issues.
Thames Water, which is on the verge of going under, provides a quarter of the entire population with its water supply. When was she told about the financial plight of Thames, and what's the plan if the worst comes to the worst and it does go under?
Can she reassure my constituents who will be really worried that whatever happens there, their day-to-day services will be protected and the much-needed upgrades that we need will still be delivered?
Of course, customers come first, and I would like to give assurances that the customers of Thames Water will be assured their water supplies and their wastewater services.
Very interesting to see how this one develops. Sean, many thanks again for now. We will come back to you again in a little bit. But to Cardiff now, and our Wales political correspondent, Rodri Lewis, who's at the Senedd for us. Rodri, party leaders have been arguing over the amount of time people are waiting for NHS treatment in Wales compared with the rest of the UK. What did they say?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that health is the subject that's most discussed here at the Senedd, especially if you include all the toing and froing over the Betsy Cadwaladr Health Board in North Wales, which we've discussed many times on this programme in the past, of course. But this week, the topic, as you said, was waiting lists across the whole of Wales. And the Conservative leader, Andrew R.T. Davies, wanted to know why there was such a difference compared with England.
I want to know what's going on here in Wales and what hope you're offering to people here in Wales. But if you want to use the English statistics, 5% of people are waiting 1 year or more in England, 20% of people on a waiting list, 20% are waiting 1 year or more. You talk about the decrease in 2-year waits. 261 people came off that 2-year wait. There's still over 30,000 people waiting 2 years or more here in Wales. In England, they have all but been eliminated, and Scotland as well. So this is an outlier that's happening here in Wales on your watch.
Those long waits are falling. They are falling in inpatients. They are falling in outpatients. Diagnostic waits and therapy waits continued to fall, particularly in therapy waits last month. And the median time, the standard time it takes to be treated in the Welsh NHS from the minute your doctor refers you to the minute your treatment is concluded is 20 weeks. That is the standard experience of a Welsh patient. From the minute they are referred to the minute their treatment is over, it takes 20 weeks.
Now, Mark Drakeford said the government would be sticking to its plans for getting the waiting list down, and he commended the hard work being done by everyone who works in the NHS.
And Rodri, this week there's also been some criticism of the First Minister's housing programme.
Yes, another Conservative member, Natasha Ashgar, quoted Labour's Shadow Housing Secretary Leila Nathoo. Now, over the weekend, Leila Nathoo said there was no answer to the mortgage crisis without building more homes. And Natasha Ashgar used that comment to question the Welsh Government's record on house building.
The government is barely building 6,000 homes a year, First Minister, when in fact we need around about 12,000. We have some 90,000 people here languishing on social housing waiting lists, and we've got more than 10,000 people living in temporary accommodation. 2 councils in Wales had households on social housing waiting lists for more than 17 years. That's shocking, First Minister. Most people can see that the key to solving a lot of problems is to, in fact, build more homes. So, First Minister, do you agree with Leila Nathoo that there is no fix to this mortgage crisis without actually building new homes?
Of course, Leila Nathoo was right that building more homes has to be part of the solution to people who don't have homes at the moment. She will have been replying to the retreat of the UK government from the plans that the Conservative Party had announced earlier in this Parliament, the abandonment under the pressure of Conservative backbenchers that have meant that Michael Gove has had to throw away the plans that he had to build more homes in England. That is the point that Leila Nathoo was making. Here in Wales, we remain committed to 20,000 new homes for social rent, built to the highest possible standards.
Now, Mark Drakeford went on to say it wasn't just a question of building more homes, but it was also about how affordable they were as well, given the current situation with interest rates and mortgages.
And Rodri, finally, members of the Senedd have also been discussing whether making voting compulsory would improve turnout at elections. What did they think?
Well, yes, this was a suggestion made by the former leader of Plaid Cymru, Adam Price, that voting should be made compulsory. He said that 26 countries across the world, from Australia to Uruguay, did compel their citizens to vote, and that turnout was as high as 90% as a result. And he said turnout for elections to this place, for the Senedd, had never gone past 50%. And that making people vote for the Senedd, compelling people to vote for the Senedd, would be transformative.
There can be no doubt that higher turnout would give the Senedd and the Welsh Government far greater legitimacy. But higher turnout would also make this Senedd more genuinely representative. The just under half of the electorate that vote at the moment is heavily skewed towards the older and more affluent voters. So the views of many of the young and the working class, especially those who feel that mainstream politics has the least to offer them, will go unheeded. Universal civic duty voting would give us instead a system in which everyone would count, not just those likely to vote.
We know that mandatory turnout can work in many countries where it is applied and enforced. Turnout is markedly different to what we see usually in Wales and indeed across the UK. However, before introducing such a fundamental change, we would need to carry out significant further consideration and consultation, and indeed there would probably need to be a clear electoral Welsh general election mandate. I think the suggestion of further research, the possibility of a pilot, is something that is well worth exploring.
So not a yes or a no, but a kind of a let's talk more about this kind of answer from the Counsel General there. But as he said, it would take a lot more work and public approval via a Welsh general election before any of this could potentially happen.
Rhodri, many thanks. Rhodri Lewis there at Cardiff Bay. Now, Sean, we've got time for one more story from Westminster. Peers voiced alarm at the failure of the 999 service on Sunday.
Yes, this was another story that was picked up when Parliament returned from the weekend. Members of the Lords asked an urgent question about this. They wanted to know what had happened, and they were also interested to know about these reports that ministers had been kept in the dark about the problems.
My Lords, this is an incredibly disconcerting event. We all rely on the 999 emergency number as our ultimate safety net at times of distress and vulnerability. Any failure in the system will undermine faith in our emergency provision. We are seemingly very fortunate that there was no major incident yesterday morning.
One of the worrying things about this incident is not the failure of the main 999 service itself, although that's bad enough. It's the backup that failed as well, my Lords. And the Minister will know that I've raised the issue of the changeover from analogue to digital on a consistent basis. Will the Minister say whether or not the incident report will also include a wider look at the changeover from analogue to digital, my Lords, because there are huge risks involved in this. This is critical infrastructure, my Lords, and in the case of emergency, it's even more important that we have an analogue backup to our digital services.
The noble Lord must be deeply troubled that not one but two critical technology platforms in our national security infrastructure have failed in a very short space of time, the Border Force as well as 999. And each case, as Lord Clement Jones has just said, with no immediate backup coming into play. Will the government ascertain whether any deep common causes underline both these failures, and therefore what other parts of our national technology structure, not just our national technology security infrastructure, may be at risk?
I recognise the risk the noble Lord describes, and one of the absolute priorities must be to identify whether there is a broader systemic risk of which the unfortunate events yesterday were a symptom, or whether this is isolated, and the ongoing investigation will absolutely establish that.
Peers there very much hoping that that 999 failure will not happen again. Now, Sean, thank you very much indeed for being with us. That's all we have time for. Great to have you on the programme. And that's all from us at Politics UK this week. Joe Coburn will be back with Politics Live on Monday at the earlier time of 9:45 on BBC Two because of Wimbledon coverage. It is that time of year after all. But remember, you can also watch on the iPlayer as well. But from all of us here, goodbye.